Too often, the story of the Powhatan is overshadowed by constant retellings of the story of Jamestown and the tale of Pocahontas. The Powhatan people then, and the many tribes of Powhatan descendants today, are more than just background characters in a badly told and often misunderstood story. This is the story of the Powhatan as they were before Jamestown, as can best be reconstructed from the testimony of their words recorded in the 17th century, oral tradition thereafter, and archaeology. Then, just as now, Powhatan is a collective term for a number of related peoples, so there will be variations throughout. And so now we're going to drop you down into the lives of the Powhatan, their worldview, culture, and history, right up until the foundation of Jamestown. Wahun is the great spirit that created the earth, an endlessly good spirit that creates and asks for nothing in return. Wahun made the structure of reality, and he set into place the laws of nature. However, Wahun is a distant spirit, not inclined to meddle in the everyday affairs of the Powhatan, the work of the spirit being creation and design. The Powhatan are part of that creation and playing their role. Wahun is often depicted as a great hare, peaceful and far off. Some believe Wahun simply left his creation altogether. The more active spirit, Oki, sometimes called Okius and by many other names, is a preserver of Wahun's creation, and he manages humanity. He demands that the Powhatan sacrifice to him and pay attention to him. He can be communed with and give favor at his pleasure. He is the one who watches humans and rewards or punishes their actions. He does so in an omnipresent fashion, and is associated with the omnipresent air for which we walk through in the sky above Wahun's creation. He is often depicted as a great warrior, sometimes young and strong, but more often large, threatening, in a form something more than human, perhaps grotesque at times. The Powhatan chiefs, known as Werowances, made sure to commune with Oki often, and they allied themselves very closely with their medicine men. Tobacco smoke could be used to open the channels of communication as it mixed with Oki's air, and they sought to do brave deeds which would grow their spiritual power like living representations of this great warrior. The later English will depict Wahun as evidence of an ancient monotheism among the Powhatan, and Oki, of course, was represented as the devil. Such will be their incorrect recasting of the roles under their own Christian worldview, a distortion. The Powhatans were Algonquin or Algonquian-speaking groups, part of a large language family extending down just south of the Powhatan to the Tsenacomoco people and their neighbors, and then all the way up into modern-day Canada. The Algonquian language family existed in what's called a large dialectical continuum, where the language would change gradually the further you traveled from your home. While Powhatan could be easily understood by their neighbors with little effort, they would be completely lost trying to communicate with the Innu farther to the north, just as an English speaker today would have difficulty communicating with someone who only spoke the related language of Hindi. The Powhatans refer to the tidewater area of what is now Virginia as Tsenacomoco, meaning roughly densely inhabited place. Archaeologists conclude that the Algonquins here developed in situ for at least 1,000 years prior to the arrival of the English. The arrival of maize as a staple crop and the development of Three Sisters farming changed the people of Tsenacomoco as it did all the natives in North America. Maize is originally a tropical crop from southern Mexico, and it took a very long time to be artificially bred for different environments, only arriving at Tsenacomoco around the year 900, and taking about 400 years to mature into the system recorded at the beginning of the colonial age. It is often a stereotype that Native Americans were a static people before Europeans arrived. This is not the case. And so to quote Dr. James Rice, a former professor of mine, I'm excited to say, concerning the people of Tsenacomoco, with agriculture came hierarchy, thus setting the stage for the Powhatan as they were just before 1607. Now, the Powhatan had some knowledge of the world extending out over the land in every direction. They knew of the Mississippi, the Great Lakes, the eastern end of the Gulf of Mexico, and of course, the further away these places were from the Chesapeake, the more vague their knowledge became. But the chiefly class could wear jewelry made from precious stones, shells, and metals that came from even further places, but of course only obtained through a chain of traders, the beginning of the chain being unknown to the end. Locally, however, the Powhatan were surrounded on three sides by others. Some were Algonquian cousins, but there were also Iroquoian-speaking neighbors and the Siouan-speaking Monacans, who were the most feared rivals of the Powhatan. It is said there existed a buffer zone between these two groups set aside for hunting, a common method to resolve a disputed border. And so with this, we can see the origin and the layout of the world that the Powhatan knew. Now, if you were born into the world of Tsenacomoco, several days after your birth, your father would gather the village about you, hold you, and give you a public name, followed by a feast and dancing. You may have received a private name as well, held between you and your family. In fact, the Powhatans and their neighbors often took on many names over the course of a lifetime as their roles changed and they passed into new phases of life. Now, even as an infant, your mother would bathe you in the cold waters of a stream to harden your body to the elements. And you would go about with little to no clothing, accepting and acclimating to the world around you. The English will later record how they were impressed with how little the Powhatan could wear in the winter and be perfectly comfortable. The young boys were prepared early to be hunters and warriors. They were made to practice with their bow and arrow. Some mothers would even withhold meals until the young lad could hit a certain target. All of the young could be set about the farms to scare off and hunt the little critters that would otherwise eat the crops. For the girls, womanhood began with the arrival of biological womanhood. For boys, however, here and throughout time, the issue of when adulthood begins is not so easily answered by a biological event. So the various tribes we collectively refer to as the Powhatan had a coming-of-age trial for their boys. In the time of the great leader Powhatan, many, but not all of the tribes, participated in a pan-tribal ceremony called the Wahunsenacawh. The boys entering their teenage years would be covered in white paint and made to dance in a ceremony of endurance, where they would be whipped if they tired out. Then each participant would be ritually abducted and rescued by different warriors. Women would watch and sing funereal dirges and cry performatively. This would be a metaphorical death of the boys' childhood, and afterwards they were whisked away to live in the wilderness for months while being tested and kept in altered states. The boys would then be returned to their families as men and would often assume a new name to match this new status. He was to be treated like a man, and his childhood considered a remote memory. Even at this young age, and in the eyes of the Powhatan, a man and woman could marry. It was part of a young man being considered fully mature and ready to participate in war and politics, is that he would take a bride. If two people found interest in one another, a young man would present wild game and fish he obtained through his own efforts to the parents of the young woman. If her parents accepted this gift, the young suitor then presented her parents with a bride wealth gift, consisting of household goods created by the women in his clan. If the parents were satisfied with this, the daughter and her parents would then go to the house of the young man, and in a public ceremony, the bride's father would place the couple's hands together and break a string of beads over their heads. These beads would be gathered later and given to the bride's father, and a feast followed the ceremony. And with this, they would be married. The bride would then go and live in the household of the husband, which the Powhatan called, and I'm going to mispronounce this and many other words throughout this program, so be warned, a yihakan. They did not use the term wigwam. It consisted of two concentric circles of saplings that would serve as an internal structure, tied together at the top with mats and reeds and pieces of bark filling in the sides. There would be a hole at the top for smoke, and a doorway consisting of a deer hide flat. Once married, the house became the wife's domain. She would keep at least a couple embers going in the fire at all times, even during the summer, rekindling it for cooking and other purposes. It became a bad omen if the fire were to fully extinguish, essentially a sign of a lack of care for the home. Women were also in charge of the farm fields. The entire community in general, including the men, would participate in the harvests, and the men would often orchestrate the slash and burn clearing of the fields, but in all other ways, the fields belonged to the women to manage. As such, it is likely that the fruits of their labor provided the majority of the calories for the Powhatan family, the sturdy maize crop alone being a carbohydrate and caloric miracle food. They had as many as 4 varieties of maize that they planted at different times in the year so that they would have earlier and later harvests ongoing, August through October. These rhythms of life affected how the Powhatan viewed the cycles of the earth, and they broke down their year into 5 seasons: a winter, called a Papanaw, a spring, called a Katapuik, an early summer that they called a Coatoya, and then a separate end of summer and early fall, which would be a harvesting season, followed by a late fall set aside for feasting and a giving of thanks for a good harvest. With maize, the Powhatan women learned to make an incredible amount of meals. When grinding their maize down into flour, they could make a hominy, corn cakes, cornbreads, seemingly in infinite varieties. They could boil the maize in a large ceramic pot or set of ceramic pots, which had to be carefully heated. This was a time before they had trading with Europeans for metal pots and pans, which they later very much desired. And women would also manage the forests. Men would burn away the dead brush to make hunting far easier and encourage young shoots for their prey to feed upon. The women would encourage the growth of the berries of the forest and the plants of medicinal value. After a few years, they would allow a field to lay fallow, and eventually, when an area's resources ran low from continued human occupation, the entire village would relocate, usually just a few miles up or down a riverway, the river being an essential component of any village. The men were in charge of hunting and fishing. That being said, if a Powhatan woman had a chance to kill prey, they would not be shamed for doing so on the land or from the waters. Likewise, a man was expected to help come harvest season. Hunting deer was the mainstay of the Powhatan, as deer would be for many on the East Coast. Hunters, when going out in pairs, could wear the hide and head of a dead deer to help lure out other deer for the killing. In larger groups, Powhatan men would set massive fires in rings that could be miles wide and have men push the prey to a certain choke point where they could be killed in large number. A Powhatan hunter told the writer William Strachey in the early 17th century that the deer population was more plentiful in past times and that men had gone to killing young deer. Of course, we know that deer populations rise and fall, but the anthropologist Helen Roundtree writes the following of the pressures faced by the Powhatan leading up to 1607 and the overhunting of deer. The attitude was probably exacerbated by the demands of the newly formed Paramount Chiefdom, but neither modern-style conservation nor a fear of punishment by animal powers for overhunting was recorded at any period for the Powhatans. We will come to meet this Paramount Chief and see why his tribute was so demanding on the people. Smaller animals were often taken using traps, and larger animals like bear, they were a great source of pride for any hunter to take. Bear was considered a delicacy, and its fat was rendered and used as a base for many of the various Powhatan body paints and topical medicines. A trusty dog might be used by a hunter to help track down birds. The Powhatan were known for making very effective bird calls. A hunter was to stay within the domain of his specific village or tribe, but could venture into the territory of another Powhatan group in order to chase down prey that he had already wounded in his own territory. At the same time, disputed hunting grounds on the edges of the Powhatan world could cause deadly battles between the Powhatan and their neighbors. The Powhatan men, for their fishing activities and travel, would create large dugout canoes. A massive tree would be laid out, and then slowly, starting from the top, and then going towards the center, the structure would be dug out, creating small fires to weaken the wood as you would scrape along the inside. The resulting canoe would be something far greater than what people today would normally associate with a canoe. They could be 50 foot long, 4 feet deep. The entire village might own one of these, because a large number of men could take them out and go spearfishing. There are reports that the Powhatan also fished by using controlled fires inside of these canoes late at night to attract jumping fish right out and into the canoe. And there are even a few references to the Powhatan using herbal concoctions to stun fish for easy spearing. More passively, the Powhatan used weirs to ensnare the fish. Then shellfish were always found in pretty good supply and always on the menu. Hunters would appeal to the spirit of Oki for a good hunt, and each husband's sense of self-worth was tied to their hunting ability, as it was how they provided for their family. Women would seek to marry a man who was a good hunter, just as a man with resources today might be seen as more attractive than the same man with nothing. That is why a male suitor presents fish and game to the family of his would-be bride, as a symbol and evidence of what he is able to provide. Collectively, this is how a husband and wife could provide for each other and their children. Some months were leaner than others between the farming and the hunting, and there were periods where the family might thin out a bit, and others where they might put on some pounds. But before every meal, they would wash their hands and put the first little bit of the food into the fire for Oki. Now, if a man was a good provider, he could marry more than one wife, given that he could support a second family and the first wife approved. Multiple wives meant larger stores of maize and more children. Women, with permission of their husbands, were allowed to have relations with other men. However, doing so in a secret fashion could be harshly punished, even by death. Remember, in the era before DNA testing, a man needed assurances that his offspring were his own. Clans among the Algonquin peoples were often matrilineal for this same reason. You could be sure you are the offspring of someone if they carried you for 9 months. If a couple found they could no longer live with one another, divorces were allowed. If children were involved, the wife could keep the home. If she remarried, however, she would have to move into the new husband's home. Now, above the family unit, the natives identified with their individual tribe and village within the Powhatan Paramount Chiefdom, over some larger sense of a Powhatan identity, a recent development before 1607 in the era just before Jamestown, as I said. Villages would again move from time to time within a designated territory, usually up and down the many riverways in Tidewater, Virginia. Each family had their own home, reflecting the importance of the individual family unit, in contrast to the Iroquoian peoples to the north, who had longhouses, where women from the same clan would each have their own section of a longhouse. These homes were not necessarily organized in straight lines with one another. A Powhatan village had room for a lot of individuality. A family had the ability to alter and move around their structures as they saw fit. There wasn't much conflict over farmland. Each family had their own plot of land. Using wooden hand tools, the women of each family ultimately could not manage fields of such sizes that they would want to absorb and fight with their neighbors over farmland. But once a family allowed the land to lay fallow, the ownership over the plot returned to the village, and the werowance was allowed to reassign the land as he saw fit, and expect tribute in return for each plot. The werowance belonged to the chiefly class. These were not exactly egalitarian people. They were of an elevated status than the common villager. This class would distinguish themselves from commoners by using and collecting jewelry of copper, pearls, shell beads, made from the goods sometimes coming from very far away, as we mentioned before. A wealthy enough family of the chiefly class might even have hired servants to further display their affluence. Men, not from this class, should not expect to grow up to become a werowance, although, if they prove to be wise and brave, they could become a counselor to the werowance. They might even marry a woman of the chiefly class, in which case his children might inherit a chiefdom, as inheritance came down through maternal relations. A werowance would often inherit their position from an older brother or maternal uncle. Likewise, they would be unlikely to pass off their chiefdoms to their own children, but onto their younger brother, or if none were left, the oldest son of the oldest sister. Again, it's all through matrilineal descent. Now, if there were no men left to inherit, a woman could inherit a leadership position. They could become a chief within the Powhatan system, and they became known as a Wahunsenacawh. I believe I'm saying that right. They, of course, could pass down their positions to their own sons, descent being certain once again. Now, the chiefly family of each village intermarried with the chiefly families of the other villages, creating a closely related upper class across the villages of Tsenacomoco, or Tsenacomoco, or Tsenacomoco, however you want to say it. The ultimate sign of a binding peace between villages was a marriage. The riverways were the natural highways for the Powhatan, and the werowance of a village expected travelers on their section of the river to come and speak with him and pay tribute if necessary. The werowance had a council to help him rule, which consisted of elders from his family, experienced warriors, and medicine men. The werowance, however, served as judge over his people and did not need to consult with his council to punish offenses or enforce laws. The werowance was believed to have great spiritual power, and his judgment was final. Part of the strength of the werowance was his connection to the medicine men. Those who could appeal to the spirits of the world and bring good fortune, well, they were in high demand, and a medicine man had a rare opportunity to travel across different groups of Tsenacomoco where needed, and if your power was impressive enough, a werewolf would entice you to settle in his village. And as your reputation grew as a powerful medicine man, so would the reputation of the village and the werewolves. These medicine men were often referred to as a quokasok. And like being a great warrior, being a medicine man could elevate your station in life. Sometimes the quokasok even had physical deformities or disabilities, which in this instance set them apart for having a superior connection to the spiritual world. A medicine man would be expected to appeal to the spirits for rain in times of drought, but many of their practices were herbal in nature, practical, physical, rather than merely spiritual. They utilized sweat lodges to purify the body, sometimes nestled near a cool lake so that a person could run from one to the other. Such practices today have modern equivalents. A medicine man could cauterize a wound, scrape off infections, drain fluids, induce the body to purge through various medicines. There's some evidence to suggest that the medicine men developed a hierarchy or order among themselves, and perhaps developed ways to identify the gifted at infancy. The anthropologist Nancy Lurie suspects that the organization of Kiwokasok, and I know I'm saying that wrong, but that's how I say it, were especially influential compared to other such groups on the East Coast because the Powhatan resisted conversion efforts so much more effectively than many of their neighbors. That being said, Virginia will not be the place where the English sent their best missionaries. Now, each village had a shrine, which looked like many of the other structures of the village, but was slightly larger and placed just outside of the village. It contained the idols and images of Oki, along with a perpetual fire. These were sacred places that only the quokasok could enter. As such, the werewolf would sometimes have his valuables kept in this shrine. Other spirits were honored here, but Oki seems to have been present in all the shrines to some degree. Further binding the spirits with the werewolves, the remains of his family were honored by being able to be stored inside of the shrine, something that commoners were not allowed to do. So far, we've covered the family, their food, the local werewolves, the medicine man and his shrine, and their worldview and the scope of the world that they knew. If all of these things were preserved well into the new year, the Powhatan would hold a number of feasts and celebration, usually coinciding with the cycles of planting and harvesting, as well as the turning over of the year. The Powhatan, like many on the East Coast, played a stick and ball game for which lacrosse is a distant descendant. They would also hold foot races and wrestling competitions, in addition to many other sports. The Powhatan also had a game involving short lengths of reeds that people enjoyed gambling on. Even those not of the chiefly class enjoyed wearing jewelry to some extent, including piercings and body paint. Often men created more elaborate presentations of themselves than the women. There would also be lots of dancing and singing and the playing of drums during these celebrations. But not all the times were good, and sometimes war was inevitable. The powerful Monacans to the west were the most persistent and threatening group to the Powhatan. But the Iroquoian Susquehannock could also be a menacing bunch. And before Powhatan's Paramount Chiefdom, there would be more local wars between the people of Tsenacomoco. War often came after a perceived injury of one group onto another. It was often the women of a man's clan who would desire for them to go to war and seek some vengeance for the injury done upon them. The werewolf and his war captain would hold a council to discuss whether or not to go to war and in what fashion to undertake the war. They would look to their medicine men for signs of whether to attack or not, when to do so, what the likely result would be, and any other information that the spirits would bring forth. This was a time for developing a consensus to go down the path of violence. Men at this time might change their names, and the body paints would reflect their dedication to entering the state of a warrior. He would call upon his allies to lock index fingers in a sign of friendship. They would give oaths with one hand to their heart and the other raised to the sun. When everything seemed to line, the men would go and leave for war. Fast raids, persistent sniping from the cover of the woods, and ambushing small groups of the enemy were the most effective strategies used by the Powhatan. Captives could be taken. Women and children were usually adopted. Men, however, were often tortured to death, the body parts kept as trophies. If you were one of these unfortunate souls, you were expected to die in dignity and not show the strain of the torture, not to beg, and to withstand the ordeal as long as possible. Now in the afterlife, you would travel west towards the setting sun and live in a village very much like the one you inhabited in life. Some of the Powhatan believed you aged in the next life as you did in this one, and then you died there and you were reborn here. Some believe this village for the dead did not exist in the west, but more accurately in the sky to the west, where Ahone lived. And with this, I have taken you through the entire life cycle of a Powhatan in the time just before Jamestown. I did this so that we could better understand the man, Powhatan, who you may know only as the father of Pocahontas. The man Powhatan had many names over the course of his life, the earliest of which may have been Wahunsenacawh, or Wahunsenacawh, or Wahunsenacawh. There's many different pronunciations and recording of this name. At least one Powhatan native will later tell the English that the father of Wahunsenacawh was sent here by the Spanish from the West Indies, perhaps a reference to the story of Paquaquinio from our Spanish Florida episodes. Indeed, Paquaquinio was from the same general area, and being of the chiefly class, he at least was a relative of Powhatan of Wahunsenacawh. Powhatan had at least 3 brothers who survived into adulthood and 2 sisters. All of the brothers were younger than himself, the next eldest brother being Opachapum, then Opechancanough, and then lastly Chiefdom. There is some dispute about the nature of the relationship between Wahunsenacawh and Opechancanough. The early English writers had an imperfect understanding of the verbiage used by the Powhatan to describe their family and the different family terms and relationships. Sometimes Wahunsenacawh and Opechancanough were referred to as cousins, sometimes brothers, and sometimes it was said that Opechancanough was actually the older brother of Opachapum, but behind him in succession. Lots of confusion here. To solve this problem, the anthropologist Frederick Leach proposes a solution wherein Opechancanough is actually only a paternal brother to Powhatan, and likely also a cousin through his maternal line. Either way, Opechancanough will be Powhatan's war chief, along with Chiefdom. The English writer William Strachey will characterize these 3 guys as a triumvirate, whereas Opachapum is often described as being somewhat unfit to lead for the most part, and we're not sure if that was a mental or physical reason or a combination of both. Wahunsenacawh, or Powhatan, inherited 6 different chiefdoms, the core of his future collective. The villages of Powhatan, Arohatac, Appomattox, Pamunkey, Youngtuganug, and Mattapony. The failed Jesuit mission in the area from the 1570s recorded that the Powhatan had recently faced a plague that killed a great number of people. This would help explain how Wahunsenacawh could inherit so many villages. A massive die-off of the chiefly class would send titles cascading down to the few survivors. From here, Wahunsenacawh, and I know I'm saying that wrong, Powhatan, grew his 6 villages into a paramount chiefdom, as I've said before, where he reigned as chief of chiefs, controlling 30 to 32 villages, perhaps totaling as many as 22,000 people by the time the English arrive in 1607. Powhatan assumed the name of his first chiefdom, Powhatan, and all those villages he subsequently controlled, despite their stronger local affiliation and identity, they will become collectively known as the Powhatan. He took these villages through a combination of marriage alliances, promises of protection in war. In the year 1596 or 97, Powhatan takes over the village of Chiefdom just after the death of their werowance. He brought on a swift attack, for which the new young werowance of the village was ill-equipped to counter. Many are killed in this attack, and then Powhatan captures the survivors of Chiefdom and redistributes them among his own villages. He then settles others at this site, and he makes his son Pawkins their new chief. Now, among the Powhatan, there were 2 warriors named Namatak and Mechumps. The English recorded their stories. One of these stories concerned Powhatan wiping out the Chesapeake tribe, just about. There might have been a few survivors who found homes in other places. This tribe is long to be suspected as harboring many of the survivors of the Roanoke colony after the collapse of the Croatoan tribe. But these were standout examples in contrast to what Powhatan usually did in a time of war. Often, he would attack a village, kill the werowance, and then take one of the werowance's daughters as a bride. They would then have a son. He would be of her clan. Then the mother and child would in time be returned to the village. Powhatan's son would now be their werowance. Powhatan would have many wives at once, and this process was repeated continuously. The total number of his offspring is unknowable. In 1607, Powhatan lived at the village of Wahunsenacawh, meaning the town of the werowance. He lived in an 80-foot-long house with many of his current wives and their combined children. The English observed 20 sons and 10 daughters. One of these daughters was born with the name Amanute. He would have the English believe that she was his favorite daughter. The historian Camilla Townsend suspects her mother was a captive from the Khigatans, and a woman from which power could not be derived. So the sad fact is that just as likely as Amanute could have been his favorite, considering how much exposure she will have to this new and dangerous group of Englishmen, she may just as well have been the most expendable. At Wahunsenacawh, Powhatan seems to have had a personal guard of 40 to 50 of the largest warriors in the country that he gathered from his many villages in the Tidewater. The only people remaining independent in this area around the year 1607 were the Chickahominy. Powhatan made his brother Opechapam the werowance of the Pamunkeys. Opechancanough ruled the Yugatans, and one powerful wife ruled as Wahunsenacawh of the Chieftdom. And I know I said that wrong. Many of his sons ruled different villages. Again, it is known that Pawkins was the werowance of the new Khiggatan population, and his son Parahunt was given the village of Powhatan. All of them, of course, would owe their allegiance to Powhatan himself, who was the werowance of werowances, known as a Mamanantuik. But much like a feudal system, each werowance under Powhatan had nearly total control of their territory and people as long as they remained at peace with the other Powhatan villages and respected their borders. There is also evidence that men like Opechancanough also operated as a sort of district werowance, managing a section of villages over the local werowance, but under Powhatan. The English and later American writers will mischaracterize the system as a confederacy, but more recent scholars have applied this term, and I've used it so many times before, I don't know why I'm only defining it now, Paramount Chiefdom, to what Powhatan had assembled. Once a year, Powhatan would tour his villages and collect tribute. The English recorded he collected as much as 80% of a tribe's production for tribute and redistribution. Such an amount would be ridiculously high and unsustainable, and perhaps this percentage only applied to the rare copper and shell beads and other little imported bits to his domain. When he would visit a town, all the warriors would present themselves to Powhatan, and they would list their feats in battle and in the hunt. Powhatan's previously mentioned Wahunsenacawh would pool together the older boys across most, but not all, of the villages of his domain and make them into young men. Given a few generations, Powhatan's growing organization and traditions could have made the Powhatan identity more important than the local tribal identity. But historians and anthropologists agree that a paramount chiefdom is a collective with a defined hierarchy, but stop short of calling this a nation state. Again, as each locale retains much of their autonomy. Of course, Powhatan had great control over the villages towards the center of his domain, and then less so on the fringes, such as on the eastern shore. In the spiritual realm, Powhatan had a strong ally in the medicine man at the shrine of Utamusak. This shrine was the holiest of holies. The man was named Utamatomakan, who we will meet in future episodes, and he may himself have been a paramount chief of sorts among the other holy men within Powhatan's domain. This great medicine man even married a daughter of Powhatan to further cement their allegiance to one another. This is in total Powhatan's world, one that I've mispronounced many different times and in different ways, and I'm sorry for that. But this is one in which a small group of Englishmen in 1607 will come to settle within. The Powhatan were not unfamiliar with Europeans and did not see them as gods, but would come to desire their weapons and other novelties that were new to the Tidewater. In our next episode, we will see how Powhatan deals with these uninvited guests and tries to integrate them into his system. Until then, this has been the Other States of America History Podcast. I'm Eric Yanis. Thank you for listening.